Hello everyone, today we talk about the tactics of the 30 Years' War. So this is a general overview, you're habituated to this approach. We will eventually descend in the actual tactics by illustrating some battle of the 30 Years' War. Again, up to now just made the 1644 Freiburg one. That is quite telling, but it's not one of the most, especially open field engagements, say, to characterize them like this, then in fact the most famous also ones of the war. Naturally, tactics can be, as we've seen also in the other general introductions about the 30 Years' War, resumed from, for example, the last video we talked about the organization, the Swedish regiment, the Spanish Tercio, etc. Today we will essentially look at that a bit through the same lens, because the Tercio set of course, the model for the Catholic armies, and was modified, of course, during the war, as we will see now, while the Swedes were the army that effectively carried out the most important tactical innovations. I also made a video, as you know, about the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War that overlaps fundamentally with our period. And that was a bit of a path opener as far as especially the Protestant side, as you know, was concerned. There are surely specialistic studies that show how much the Spanish had actually experimented themselves with the similar systems actually that the Dutch and the Swedes would develop. But there is also a reason why they remained more conservative in their broader organization, and in part they did pay for it, but this must always be contextualized, because tactics are the last step of the downwards from the chain of politics and strategy. So that must be understood as just the policy of an army like the Spanish one, that, like others, had different standards that still worked pretty well, as we will see now. And the Swedes also were in a very particular situation that favored them, and that let them, that gave them the opportunity to update, to innovate, to test, to experiment, and with great results, because fundamentally the art of war from the second decade to the fifth of the 17th century did change substantially. So what we see now is a sort of stereotype picture of the wall, always bearing in mind, by the way, that even though, and we said it very often, Western warfare was somehow very standardized, so that you can look, of course, at these differences, but more generally looking at armies and seeing that they were pretty similar in many ways. There were still, of course, many forces that were declined, in fact, to the peculiar type of political and social background. There was a lot of conservatism here and there, but in the very heart of Germany itself, we've seen it. Countries like Saxony and Brandenburg were expression of more rudimentary systems altogether, and just war at the time was even just aside. We often say, well, there were these reforms, explained it countless times, made videos about Gustavus Adolphus, about, again, the Dutch army. We've seen Wallenstein. We will keep on, say, scoping those areas like in depth, and we have observed how, of course, much of what we say, this was essentially a reform and innovation, tactical development, but on paper, because what we know happened on the battlefield was very often very different from first of all, the ideal structures. Armies were naturally always under strength, seriously depleted, etc., and there is not just pitched battles, as you know well. So changes occurred because the system of this entire powers was changing within itself. So talking about the 30 Years' War is scary in a way, because first of all, we tend to ignore the level of, say, even when saying, looking at the distractions, we don't picture concretely what it is. Millions of people killed, and incredible devastations that really did change the way Europeans thought. In some ways, of course, I always stress the continuity with the past. There is not just the, say, epiphenomenal tip of the iceberg that you have to use to describe something, and still was mostly determined by the what is underneath the water there. But of course, the change, especially the tectonic, most subterranean changes, were incredibly powerful, and were pushing towards, in fact, some military developments, such as Louis XIV's army, that truly became the continentally hegemonic one, and that is somehow excluded chronologically from the so-called military revolution that, if just confronted with what happened immediately afterwards, and looking at essentially half of a millennium that took from passing from pikes to muskets, fully, like the thing is, even more evident. Like, I think we just told military history wrong. It's in so many ways that is almost unspeakable. All right, and we will talk about them yet again. Now, talking about the 30 Years' War tactics, of course, one must do that aforementioned level of synthesis and conceptualization. Otherwise, we get nowhere. We have the other videos. I will keep doing even more in-depth stuff, but this is the broader picture. So, how was a battle fought? Right, that's essentially the thing. Well, in the 30 Years' War, there were this kind of different approaches, depending on essentially the military culture of the contenders. It could be quite varied, as we've seen, but revolved around, again, a dominant model that was the Spanish one, and so also the one spread among most of Germany and and Italy, etc., whoever, say, within the Holy Roman Empire sided with the Habsburgs, and some models that emerged from it, because this was literally the dominating one. There was no other power, right, other than Spain, that had developed the same degree of military fitness. France had its period of confessional clashes. That's where a sound French native infantry had been developed, aside from the Swiss one that was preferred to it, and now was instead decaying. So again, more or less all countries in Europe had the same, say in Western Europe, especially pike and shot military culture, but there were different ways to it, depending also on the size of the forces involved. Right? Always remember this, that the most qualitative performing armies out there are the ones of peoples that have let's say, that are favored by certain conditions, and that can exploit, generally speaking, the average of the bigger power that is big exactly because it's very strong. As von Clausewitz says, that the entire point of strategy is being very strong. It may seem banal, but as an explanation, but it's not. In this sense, it doesn't have to be qualitative necessarily, right? So this may sound confusing. I'm introducing it because, of course, if you look at the Dutch perspective, right? That's literally a country that was made at the time, essentially freeing itself from the Habsburgic one, and in that case fighting directly with the Spanish, and that so represented actually quite a thorn in the side for Spain, that was quite financially strained by the 80 Years' War, etc. But that was, in the bigger scheme of things, even an army that wouldn't become, for example, an hegemonic one, like in fact the Spanish one had been the French one, would become. But that would be, for example, the best in the world in the late 17th and the early 18th century on the base of cost-benefit ratio from an economic point of view. There is no doubt that the most qualitative army, in fact, in the 30 Years' War would be the Swedish one. Right, and the Swedes would maintain essentially, because it didn't necessarily, like what happened under Gustavus Adolphus is not exactly the same that would happen under another sovereign. In general, the Swedes would maintain that that qualitative level, even improving it further, there's no doubt, I don't know, that the Carolina of Charles XII were the best force in Europe at the time, but Sweden was not the greatest power in Europe at the time. So it's important to just be flexible about this, because of course that's the entire point of evaluating tactics for what they were as an ancillary function of strategy. So that if you have lots of forces you can pour in at the moment, there is always this sort of compromise between tempestivity, effectiveness, and efficiency. You need to intervene in a way that must be primary and that unavoidably will reduce the other two, right? So normally you get to a sort of equilateral triangle as far as these three aspects are concerned. But again, the greatest powers have maybe the best technologies at hand, but not necessarily the capacity of standardizing the entire forces through that, because otherwise it would be extremely costly. That's why the US are a superpower, but say the best doctrines are, the ones of Canada, of Belgium, right? And that definitely are not, enormous military powers, even. So this is also deeper because, of course, for example, the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War was something more than just the nation as such, and it was naturally entering in a world that is the border world, and that is also balanced by different issues. And in this regard, it's not to mitigate Swedish power in that sense, but exactly instead to point out how much it stood out, exactly because it was just fighting against a much bigger reality. We often get the sense that, again, the greatest power is necessarily the one that must be the best, because of course the world was changing, was being torn apart, right? What happened during the 30 Years' War, also from an ideological point of view, we tend to attribute some positive meaning in relative and in absolute terms, and especially the latter is somehow not just debatable, but it should be seen also in perspective what ideologies were really spreading in that sense, and why we think today that we're positive in the wake of what happened from there to now, which that is definitely questionable. In any case, speaking of military cultures, really, the Spanish system had been proven successful at that point for over a century, right? Spain had dominated European battlefields in its, at least, art of war since the beginning of the 16th century. The Italian wars, Gonzalo de Cordoba's essentially true pike and shot affirmation that before wasn't that synergic. In fact, it's with the Battle of Cerignola that you really have finally pikemen and arquebusiers managing to stop effectively what had been the best European feudal cavalry of the time. So, as you know, I also, as a PhD in military history and medieval warfare specifically, I attribute a dramatic importance still to cavalry throughout not just the end of the Middle Ages, in which there is no such positivistic, deterministic, theological idea of cavalry essentially being supplanted as such, but not even throughout the following periods that undeniably were, especially the mid-16th century, moment of greatest contraction of cavalry on the field. We will see the role of the mounted arm there. In any case, again, the core, of course, of Spanish warfare, and the one that had actually stemmed from the Swiss, eventually copied by the Landsknechts. I made a video about them, illustrating that aside from the fortunes of all these, right, the Swiss fell. Also the Landsknechts, by the time of the 30 Years' War, weren't really a thing anymore. Well, the Spanish Tercio really was, right? And this also had evolved, right? And today there is no time to refer to that specifically, but I will make a video about Spanish infantry throughout, say, this century and a half. and it had really been the dominating force, mostly because of this great Spanish moral and material superiority, right? The sense that this army was, first of all, an army of volunteers, right? And that wasn't even under a specific discipline, because the mere honor of participating to it would backfire as complete dishonor in the moment in which you would have defected, right? You would have had a ruined reputation and so on. Naturally, things were very complicated, but as we've seen in the previous videos, well, the Tercios had reached a level of sort of institutionalization, even in terms of, let's say, complaint to central government. The monarchy recognized the instances of the soldiers, and this force was really highly respected. Basically, all the subjects, again, of the Spanish monarchy were trained. Also, we're talking again parts of Italy, just also parts of the Holy Roman Empire that copied directly from the Habsburgic model, the Spanish one. The same Landsknechts, just to make an example, were in their flamboyant clothes, etc., sort of punks, but actually inspiring themselves to Spanish fashion, etc. So Spain naturally was rocking hard at the time, and provided with this dramatic amount of power. Her military was challenged, no doubt, and the 30 Years' War are perhaps, if not the best image of this, because the theater of Central Europe is not exactly the one in which, in spite of the way of Flanders, the road of Flanders, the Spanish can fully intervene to scale, but let's say the neighboring Netherlands, that in that sense constitute the first true case of secession from the Holy Roman Empire, which is often overlooked. Mostly talk about the Swiss in that sense, but that was actually a more gradual thing institutionally. The Dutch fracture was much more violent, as you know, much more abrupt in many ways. Well, that really shows still how the problems of Spain, the priorities of Spain. It was very involved in the Mediterranean, of course, in the Atlantic. I recently started a little thing about the 1588 Armada, etc. So there is especially by the 16th to 17th century, a truly just global perspective from Europe, because of the discovery of the New World and the opening of, say, routes across the globe, but also a sort of much greater share and sort of fluidification, uniformation among Europeans, and especially the ones of the West, right? And some parts, even of the Holy Roman Empire, were fringe relatively to that, right? Not just there were some systems that we've seen were more primitive, but just further east, it was just the steppes. There were the Ottomans, there were the Tartars, right? So you have also more picturesque military systems like the Polish, the Lithuanian one, that is somehow unique, given the sort of geopolitical context in which they were developing. The Swedish entered into play, as we know, in a quite surprising fashion, right? Because even though France paid Sweden and essentially for the creation of her army, because that's literally how it happened, aside from the Swedish raw material, especially metals exports and so on, that during a war, as you understand, were quite needed, and Sweden would maintain that kind of product, even still today, of weapons, of armor, etc. It was not to be given for granted that a Gustavus Adolphus would come into the scene, right? That the Swedes would actually develop that successful approach, nor that they would be able to develop on the base of Maurice of Nassau's Dutch model that had already, as we will see now, been toying with certain concepts and certain, say, uniformation, certain tactical flexibility for what were, generally speaking, in fact, smaller armies than the Tercio, countries that were under much greater pressure in relative terms than the Spanish Empire in that theater, and that thus needed to innovate in order to cope with the most powerful military in the continent. Then there is, as we were just saying, a sort of, we could call feudal model, right? A sort of relic of the Middle Ages that, if you look at Europe for what it was, right, you could argue that would remain standing until 1792 or even 1918 in the actual essence of it. But there's this sense that, again, everything that happened in the Renaissance was modernity as opposed to sort of the perished medieval anachronism that was wiped out by guns. No, right? This world was again incredibly rudimentary, worked more or less in the same basis in which especially up to the end of the 30 Years' War, the Middle Ages had worked. Right, but again, there were some powers that were more evidently backwards on the path of military development and update, and in this sense would also pay for it on the battlefield. Naturally, that also mirrors of course, a coalition warfare in which you have even certain examples of great bravery and capacity from the side of these feudal forces, but that are somehow integrated within a broader model without which they could have not probably even taken the field. But you understand that in a Germany fragmented in hundreds of principalities, etc., and all that incredibly machinous system that had somehow emerged from the Federation, there was also room for maneuver. Of course, these systems were good enough, given the context, and when pressured, they were able to update to some degree. So we're talking a sort of system, you can say a feudal army, feudal array, right? That we will exclude from the deeper analysis compared to the Spanish and the Swedish system that we will use as sort of archetypes here to make the thing simpler. But always remember that. Think about, I don't know, Croatian cavalry or things that were extremely exotic stuff that really tasted steppes like to a great degree, and still like rudimentary, even primitive militia systems, things that worked mostly on a provincial basis. Right? So the Spanish system, again, was built upon the Tercios regiments. In battle, each Tercio deployed in the famed Spanish square. Right, it was this particular array we're describing now was different from the previous ones, or at least had been systematized as such. So we're talking about essentially 1,500 men in a solid pike block, roughly 40 men wide by 38 deep. So in theory, right, then things could be different, right? But the idea was this square eventually covered on each face by a thick line of musketeers, and at each corner by a block of 300 arquebusiers. So several such outfits would be deployed in a single line facing the enemy. So imagine all these squares being deployed, not necessarily like they could be also multiple lines in depth. There was this sense again of general strategy respected as far as also medieval times were, right? There were different battle lines, so that you would have to consume like the first and sending in the second, etc. But primarily this battle line was relied on by the Spanish because the bulk of the forces were sufficient, as we will see now, to especially in defense, right, to be quite courageous. Let's put it in this way. As the sense is that the pikemen had to advance, right? Pike, the greatest difference, let's say, from medieval times that the Swiss in the second half of the 15th century break fundamentally is that they would advance to attack frontally an enemy formation, including a cavalry one, right? This cavalry was in this picture ipso facto losing, in fact, importance, but that was the sense, having enough collective training that only some sort of, it's called in modern states by degree of concentration of power could provide, in order for these guys to be functionally aggressive with the pike, which didn't mean actually to be pretty good with the pike. It had to be pretty good by remaining information during that hellish experience that these fights were. In the front of this line of squares, there would be a number of heavy artillery pieces deployed, while the flanks would be covered by cavalry, ideally, right? But the idea was that, especially artillery in the front, that this pike squares were, doesn't matter how aggressive, still massive pike squares. So they were overall relatively slow, and so these, everybody who is acquainted with pike and shot warfare knows the degree of, say, of attrition and also of graduality, however, of the engagements between these forces. The fact that there was no, especially with the reduction of cavalry shock charges effectiveness, the element that could push for sort of resolutive event that would break the entire formation as such. In the Middle Ages, it would have even a pocket of knights who could essentially attack the flank of a cavalry battle line and literally cut it in half. At this point, considering the numbers, the size of the units, etc., this thing basically resolved itself largely through an incredible level of outwearing, let's say, through this slow engagements, so this incredibly, again, unrefined pike fighting technique, trying to, again, pierce others. Like, there were units that had somehow the ungrateful task, right, of trying to break through the pike lines, passing under the pikes themselves, or through with massive swords. There's a bit of mythology around it, but again, what can happen on a battlefield can really, you would have really seen these things happening here and there, to some even effectiveness. But again, a small unit tactics really, and plus the shot that is, again, important. It can start really causing remarkable damage to enemy formations, but also this on a long time, right? The one that was effectively bought by this massive blocks of pikemen for essentially not advancing against each other's shot, because this is also the mechanism of pike and shot warfare, that pikes existed as long as the shot wouldn't be enough to wear them completely out, right, during the approach, right, because the advance to maintain these pike blocks, in spite of the intensive training, also was relatively slow, because it's still very complicated to make the whole thing work adequately at that level. And there is a sense of staticization of warfare here and there. It touches on different arms differently, right? Artillery would show this actually towards the end of this period, like the very 30 Years' War. Cavalry in the mid-16th century. Infantry had a gradual fluidification over time as well, but the ultimate abandonment of the pike would happen after the 30 Years' War. So imagine what is fascinating, in fact, criticizing that sense of reform, of innovation and update, is that these systems were very similar to one another. There were not many other options. I mean, the pike and shot warfare is not technically that different from even the age without shot, right, and missile fire in general, and cavalry. I mean, these are some constants. But you do evidently see that factors are somehow changing faster than it used to be in the past. This civilization did realize it, of course, because this was accelerating at an unprecedented rate, right, in the art of war in the first place. And it was evident that firearms were also becoming ever more performing, whereas there is not much that you can do to improve the performance of a pike, or even a pike formations as such. So this for saying the artillery could be placed relatively close at the enemy to pound the foe for a while, at least. Then the Tercios would make out to deliver, or in rare instances receive an attack. There were gaps naturally. This pike squares, the single Tercios would be substantially separated from one another, differently from, say, other, of course, spaces that existed always between a subunit and another within. But the idea is that the pike at that point block could not be, there was no way to break through it before having at least dramatically shattered it, soften it up, and making it break through some kind of concentrated forces that had to literally basically either surround it for at least 3 sides or a couple, depending on the difficulty, and obliging them to. Of course, there were situations in which, depending on who attacked and were defended, that say they would attack but wouldn't manage to break through, or maybe they were pushed away from the field, but still they would be able to retreat in some good order. All right, the concept of the pike was also this, that cavalry can get out of the way when things are getting worse. Cavalry doesn't necessarily have the capacity to break it through. Remember that, I don't know, there are instances even later on at the Battle of Vienna, much later of course, but some Saxon musketeers retreating from the battlefield for kilometers, right, being harassed by French cavalry and still simply retreating in square formation, that also people think it's just defensive, just like essentially the spike squares you would think. No, they were also, of course, and that was the point, were trained to be mobile as well. So there is no complete staticization. This thing becomes more static only when you increase the scale of the picture, right? It's much easier again to do incredible things with a smaller unit that in proportion a bigger one, right? With a smaller unit you can easily, score at some point, 1 to 10 kills, right, between yours and the enemy, or perform some strange maneuvers, etc. But this is much more complicated with bigger systems, with bigger the spike squares, etc. And this is essentially what the Dutch and the Swedes were toying with, right? Smaller forces, but somehow more mobile, to harass these leviathans that the Spanish tercios really were. So the armies of the Catholics that were fundamentally based on that model, at least. So the enemy approach under the shot fire, right? So when enemies approached, the Spanish Catholic shots would let go as many volleys as possible. This was done by having the front rank men and occasionally second rank ones firing and then counter-marching down the files, which required some training. Also, technology had rendered it ever more effective, also in terms of literal front extension and fire concentration, because, as you know, originally the bandoliers were, especially with the matchlock, everything was extremely dangerous. Like, people could explode like next to one another if the bandoliers were ignited in some way, then the powder began to explode. So the order of the shot was usually larger at the beginning of the period, and then with gradual improvements became smaller, right? The firearms became more efficient, more effective, and they progressed, just also increasing in number. In any case, it was already understood that by counter-marching and essentially reforming a line behind the last one of the array, by still maintaining the order of the rank, right? Because that was the point. That's actually the idea of counter march, which in warfare is something more specific. Telling the truth, it serves the purpose of changing front rather. Here it was a sort of smaller version of the caracol that we will see now for cavalry, right? But that required some specific training. It took time to where, so there was a standardization that way. This had never been quite tried in the art of war, right? Yes, there are some instances in medieval warfare in which crossbow fire was alternated with the various ranks shooting with a specific order, whatever. But this idea of, moving, like channeling fire in an ever more orderly rhythm and constant fashion was just appearing, right, for the first time, because otherwise missile forces had historically always been scattered, and still at this time it was like the case. If you look at the English Civil War especially, but in many other contexts of the 30 Years' one, you realize that with edges, like in engagements where of course the pike, this massive pike squares could simply not move because there was, I don't know, an orchard, a farm of this walls, etc. There was a much greater emphasis on skirmishing with a shot, and thus also trying to fluidify the employment of this arm in function of the fact of that more, say, less geometrical fashion. But that, of course, regarded the smaller engagements. Of course, on the battlefield, things were being increasingly geometrical, as we just pointed out. But that's also because firearms were increasing in importance. It could be deployed much more easily, not just as light infantry, as they would become heavy by the end of the century, which means that they would hold the ground against pikemen and against the same cavalry alone. Now, meanwhile, during this fire exchange, the infantry masses on both sides would be drawing closer. As things began to get personal, let's say the shot would be forced normally to retire behind the protection of the pikes. At this point, they could fire in the gaps between the squares and other subdivisions. Sometimes the Dutch developed a system, for example, that was literally inspired to a dance, because they made this sort of pirouette, right, passing fast and shooting, in that very moment they passed in between the various units, just naturally in front of this corridor, whatever was in front of there, so because most of the front was covered by your own troops, and cycling that, right? So having a guy that passes at every second or so that shoots, right, and that can maintain this constant fire, which is, as you understand, not even the most efficient way of employing the shot, because tactics would develop eventually at a collective level, not this sort of, even when platoon fire emerged, like this need of maintaining a continuous fire, even when diluted over time, something that entered the dichotomy of the doctrine for other reasons. But the most important thing is that you shoot, especially the first volleys before everything is covered in smoke and you literally can't see anything, in the most orderly and collective and concentrated way as possible, because that is much more effective than the same amount of shots fired across the same time but diluted across the same time. You can have these poses, but if you shoot the same amount of bullets in a single moment, you will cause much greater effect on the enemy, psychologically and physically, right? So that it's a parity of shots and even maybe of hits. You still make more damage overall to the enemy formation, because what you do is disorder in it. That's the point, right? It's not even killing people per se, which with a shot at that point would occur anyway. Passing to heavy infantry, the pikemen, right? There were still other halberdiers, people equipped with still even pole arms of some different type, etc. They were required to, of course, maintain this solid wall of pike points. That was the entire thing. And knowing that they would have, again, been depleted in the process by other pikemen and a shot, right? So it was somehow ungrateful task, especially to be in the very first lines where some units were paid more, exactly in this view, etc. Now, speaking of the order of the pikemen, this could vary naturally. we have a closest order of just a few tens of centimeters to a sort of so-called double open order that was up to 3 meters, even more than 3.5 meters, right? So the former was used when receiving cavalry, obviously, because the sense is that you have to avoid anyone getting in, and especially cavalry, because the men behind you are not better. This is true. This is something that comes from together with the art. Rarely, say, the best men are in the outer part of the square, right? These guys are also the ones that are literally leading the file, right? The ones that, just for reasons of training maneuver, the guys behind have to follow, right? So there is all a deep implication even about the maneuver on the same battlefield that depends on this unavoidable fact that is, of course, those guys that are in the first lines must be the toughest ones, but are also receiving greater losses, right? While the double open order was preferred for formations under artillery fire. And there had been instances in pike and shot warfare, of course, of how the sheer level of brutality of course, entire squares. Think about the Swiss at Marignano, like literally thrown in 2 pieces, but like, a strike at bowling, when they found themselves essentially isolated in front of artillery and being thickly packed. And of course, you couldn't quite operate that easily, even maneuvering or getting out of the way with such open order. That still did take the aforementioned level of training to be performed, and would reduce still you could be under artillery fire while engaged against an enemy formation. Somehow more difficult if, especially in major engagements, there is just a frontal attack and the cannons can't quite shoot with that precision over, say, the hands of their own men without risking them. But it did happen, and there was this kind of horror going on. And as we will see, the Swedes actually would exploit this by essentially using smaller cannons, but they could bring very, very close and pull out together with the rest of the units, so-called leather cannon, just to make this devastating gaps in the enemy pike formation and getting out of the way, just for, of course, other arms to exploit, because these things did cost, but again, training, if done properly, can maximize dramatically with combined arms the results, and even of specific hardware that you need to carry this out. The technique was also less powerful, right? But if used more surgically, the smaller units could cause devastating losses, given the asymmetry of, say, attacking the enemy from the flank, while engaged, for example, with other units, which was the sense, right? The Swedish formations, we will see, were much thinner, but also, as a consequence, much more extended. So there was no real major game changer in that. It was still a sort of iron arm between forces that are dramatically, exerted, and that can't simply say who's going to win or not. But it's also a way of, say, testing what in practice, because this is not a purely geometrical reality, the thing will get down to, and especially if you have, again, greater collective training as far as the interaction, especially the various units, are concerned. If they have more autonomy, better commanders, etc., that you can definitely get the upper hand. And so the greatest victories of the Swedes were caused by this, but also the Catholics didn't sit there and watch only. Anyway, the preferred order for pikemen to engage against one another was a bit less than half a meter, right, between each soldier. Wu tried essentially his best to jam his pike into his opposite number, right? And that's it. It was frenetic. Again, it didn't actually say that the development of pike warfare didn't actually increase the sophistication of the thing. Actually made it even messier. But it was in fact about the mass, right? About the moral force behind that, the physical moral force, and this continuous sort of trust into the enemy and attritioning like that. Meanwhile, if there was sufficient room, the front rank musketeers might be able to get off a few shots, as we've seen, from between the more or less tightly packed ranks of the pikemen even, right? Yes, there was even this thing. It was not really the best thing. It was mostly between the various units gaps, right, if they could. The arquebusiers, let's say, of the corner blocks or sleeves would try to get off enfilading volleys, of course, because that their point is they're like little redouts, right? The idea is that there is a symmetry with the units that you have to fight against, and so if the enemy enters, right, clashes just frontally with the pikes and sets in between the corners, the shot corners of the Tercio formation, those guys can somehow outflank them, right? The idea of still having a musketeer arriving at relatively close range and, shooting straight into someone and, is incredibly violent. Again, these weapons were incredibly underperforming in terms of precision and range, but a close range with, of course, a visible target, you have people even thrown to pieces by this thing. Because the problem initially also was that they were massive, right? So eventually the same technology, of course, refines on the basis of tactics and doesn't quite actually increase the power per se, but just in function of range and precision for those collective use that had to be carried out. So everything was bent to that. Remember, technology has always a minimal impact on the development of tactics. It's tactics that make technologies specifically. And the other way around is again, minimal. And of course, at this point, being there no bayonet, because the pikemen still essentially could afford, again, to go out there in the field and reaching the enemy lines in a still cohesive fashion that the shot could not break alone. This was all a very risky business. I mean, a shot coming that close to the enemy. Of course, there were other issues. For example, the pikemen alone could not really perform against enemies. Of course, there were swords around, etc. And at that point, if you have just a gun, you can try your luck and shooting this guy at close range, but you have to get the hell out of the way, which you could even do more easily, right? Because these guys were still relatively armored, right? But again, everything was sometimes much more blurred than the idea. So tendentially, the things that work the most are this sort of combined tactics that are based on, say, a quite specific distinction of the units, and mostly making the shot getting out of the way. Because this was actually the great theoretical problem. How do we solve throughout a time in which you have, again, this problem that the shot alone is not decisive? How do you, and because the pike can reach it and kill it, how do you distribute the forces? Yes, you can alternate. There were many experiments in this regard. You can dilute these forces across the line and intersperse them in different ways. But the idea is that, again, if you have a unit, a functional unit in front of you, and this is made of shot, like if you have the pike in front of you, that's going to be a soft spot of some sort. In fact, again, the only useful space was the one between in this case, between the tercios themselves, right? That, again, I explained countless times in the history of tactics, the gaps that exist within the formations, within the various units, etc., are normally not exploitable, right? The myth that if a line is discontinuous because I don't know, there is a 3 or 10 or 20 meters gap, that is okay for, I don't know, another formation to squeeze in and enter. There's actually no advantage whatsoever into that, because you have to abandon your own integrity as a unit that obviously works to clash frontally with the enemy. In warfare, there is no shortcut to it. Actually, you're wasting your potential and becoming weaker and being killed more easily if you try to do that. Given that, again, missile units were historically, again, more like they were normally operating in open order, and even in these cases where they were more somehow ordered in a, say, less loose way, you could, they were still movable, right? They were definitely more mobile than the pikes. Well, you could make them operate within these gaps, right, without actually creating. There were instances in which, I don't know, cavalry could carry out bravadas, because sometimes the distances between the various tercios could be remarkable. So you would enter, like, I don't know, even at Waterloo, see, you know, the French cavalry charged on the British squares, etc. We see cavalry could pour in and turn around, but there was no advantage to it. They were into it just risking, right, with a broken formation, not delivering the fullest of their charge for what, right? To be worn out, to suffer losses, right? That's not how tactics really work. Everything has to be very very functional, very precise. Keep it simple. That's quite a motto in the military. Now, during all of this, artillery kept operating, right? Again, distance between different units, also smaller than the Tercio, did allow this sort of, again, still risky exposure of artillery to the front, but still capable of carrying out some enfilade fire a bit themselves, etc. So the hits could be devastating, yet consider that a heavy piece would be able to shoot perhaps 8 or 10 shots an hour, right? So definitely not much for what this arm should be doing, that is, in this context, so in the peak, in the critical moment of the engagement, trying to get off as many rounds as possible. But they did. Artillery had, of course, been employed in pitched battles from, you know, at least 3 centuries. It had not been a game changer, would never actually be per se, right? But of course, it could tip the balance of the entire forces that were involved, right? That were, as we've said before, equilibrated, like any other arm could do for that matter. So this was a concert. Every instrument had to play right. You needed the right training, the right equipment, the right command, the right coup d'oeil, luck, because most, say, lots of things at least will not be, like, really most things will not be foreseen in the way they will actually happen. So everything was crucial, and this system was, in fact, becoming ever more integrated. These arms were all becoming ever more depending on one another. So meanwhile, cavalry would be looking for a chance to charge. Now, the cavalry charge was made at canter, which is something like 45 kilometers per hour, habitually in thick columns at this point, with the intention of permitting the troopers to get off a few rounds of pistol fire. Now, there were different types of cavalrymen, also very different types. There would be the cuirassier, the lancer, the pistolier. There would be ethnic, let's say, cavalries, still, I don't know, using even the bow at this point in some circumstances. However, most cavalry tactics had functionalized to, yes, usually this either like infantry, like either heavy cavalry for the shock or light cavalry for the skirmish. There had been this sense of cavalry not being able to break through functionally, so that they would try to hybridize even heavy cavalry as a sort of functionalized one in the function of pistoliers. Right, this is the concept, especially of the Reiter, of the caracol, which is a term derived from the Spanish, which means snail, because just as we've seen for the foot shot, the idea was to carry out this counter march. Right, this was also the reason why cavalry was deployed in column rather with a broader front. Not always, by the way, but the sense was that you would approach the enemy. Very often in this channels of fire could be quite deadly, so the guys at the head of the formation were crucial to spot like where to hit and not. And yet when arrived to the point, they would essentially carry out in front of the enemy, so also the column was partly to maintain order during this process, not dispersing fire too much, to shoot right in line, rank after the other, and then one exhausting the bullet, coming back at the end of the line, reloading, right, until your turn came again. And the sense was shooting again this unloading these pistols at very close range, and it was effective to some degree. It was not the most, say, compared to what habitually the foot shot did. Of course, this was much less effective fire, but it was somehow more concentrated if you managed to carry out this tactics effectively in a single point. And the idea for cavalry was that if you soften up enough that section of the enemy line, you could eventually charge into it. Sometimes literally throwing the pistol, doesn't matter how the wheel lock mechanism that was cutting edge cost, right? The German clock makers, but were renowned. That's also what the Reiter evolved like from this sort of German idea of the tactic. But again, it's war, right? People get at some point really nervous, and they pass to the sword or the lines, and they will charge. Naturally, you could have different types of cavalry, could do either one thing or the other, but it is always the same. That if you have somebody on horseback, still that sense of smashing into an enemy line because you're riding a beast that weighs several hundred kilos, like is still quite obviously capable of literally breaking somebody's body quite easily, right, and opening a gap into the enemy line, trying to push to see if the entire line crumbles at that point. For the rest, again, cavalry was still, there had been a coming back, again, especially in the second half of the 16th century, of cavalry that had been quite gradual until, as we'll see now, the reforms of Gustavus Adolphus. There was perhaps a sense of lack of confidence in cavalry, but this is also true because, again, the Catholic system that was prevalent was somehow based on bulkier formations, and just for the political and strategic reasons that brought this war to be fought. And the good enough was in fact enough. Most of the times there was no need, given that enormous cost, to improve more than much, even though it would happen, as we will see. And there are great epic equestrian engagements during the 30 Years' War that really show also how, of course, knights had not died, right? The European aristocracy was incredibly bold and crude and violent and arrogant and ambitious and deserving and truly elite and superior. And especially when you look at this moment of greatest contraction of cavalry just before the 30 Years' War, you realize that, again, the fusion of the shooter with the charger is something typically, say elite, like professional, to a degree that well suited the aristocratic background of many of these people. Right? It's rare on these battlefields to find so many troops that are on horseback that are cheap, right? Of course, they are the majority, but they're still contained numbers, and in proportion, the aristocracy was importantly engaged here. Cavalry was the the least important, at least of the, aside from artillery, of the various arms. But for this reason, you could also have this sort of blitzes, and everybody had their own styles, their own ideas. But again, Lancers, the idea that full cavalry charges were launched also against pikemen. By the way, that's something really unusual. But if the enemy formation was worn up enough, that's what they had to do in the first place. Through combined arms, but still. So, as you understand, in this system, you don't perceive much creativity. It's a massive wrestling, right? That derives from the bulk of the Tercio, Pike square, and the general capacity to field it, to maintain this incredibly stubborn capacity on the field, that in fact did win battles. I mean, technically, the first phase of the 30 Years' War was the end of the 30 Years' War. Like, the Catholics had won. Germany was conquered by the Spanish and the Austrians, their allies. It was over, right? The war could end technically like that. Of course, as you know, it didn't, also because it would have not been also known like the 30 Years' War. But that tells you at the beginning how much potential, just, of course, not the military, but the military as an instrument of politics, and so what effectively moves everything, really had. Right? The Catholics had won on the battlefields. I will make a video that will make a very brief story of the entire 30 Years' War, so we will see single commanders, etc. So I have planned a bit of different stuff regarding this. However, you know that, of course, the war, in fact, first of all, didn't end there, but we will pass immediately to the Swedes, that somehow epitomize again the alter ego, right, of the Catholic war, right, as a very motivated, fanatic Protestant force that really strikes this incredible blow in virtue of the superior quality of their forces. And there is no doubt about that. So Gustavus Adolphus' system, I will not digress again on whom actually created the system, because, of course, much of what is credited to all these reformers didn't necessarily kick in, even during this reformer's life, or was even started by them, whatever. But the point is that, especially about Sweden, there was a great vision in the way that the army was created, especially from home, and then financed, and then, in this sense, employed. It had been a matter of experience gained on the battlefields, not just the ones of the 30 Years' War, as we were recalling in the other video, in the previous video, about the war. There were many wars that we say, like more or less the 30 Years' War, but that were in the tens that intertwined with this one. Think about the Swedish experience against the Poles, the Polish hussars especially, and so the Swedes had matured a great experience and had a particular amount of insight about the potential of the various arms when just under specific pressure, real circumstances on the battlefield, and had began to develop the army in that direction. Plus, there was the theoretical and in part also practical, of course, insight provided by the fellow Dutch Protestants of Maurice of Orange-Nassau, that in fact had emphasized especially flexibility, also cavalry in part, rather than the solidity and infantry. And this is obvious because the Dutch were fighting, say, not avoiding the enemy, but say trying to, at least they had more precious resources, right, than the Spanish, and so they, for their cause, and so they needed to preserve them from the, say, this greatest, say, to avoid what the Spanish were stronger at, right? It could be really vital for the Dutch Revolution. Now, Gustavus regiments deployed in battalions or brigade masses rather than regimental ones, which means, as we've seen in the previous video about organization, that while the Tercio basically commander just controlled the various companies, the Swedish regiment was subdivided in, let's say, operationally autonomous brigades that were also supported by an autonomous artillery force that could intervene to support them according to the circumstances. So already from the organic, as we pointed out, you can realize how these forces were acting in a more divided thing, or at least more autonomously from one another on the field, right? Trying to increase again the sense that one chunk could do one thing while the other was doing another, naturally and hopefully in a coordinated way. So exploiting the circumstances, and as we'll see now, working a bit more with combined arms within the same brigade, right? So each one of these units had essentially a pike block in its center with intervals very much as in the Spanish army. You would count essentially some like 3 lines in each one of these forces. Like the first one would be made of the shot, say of about 4 men by 6. They weren't enormous, right? But you say 4 in the first line, then you had a central line of pikemen, plus other 6 shots on the same second line on the right and left, 3 on the right, 3 on the left, then the pikes. Then you would have still a shot, two shot blocks in the third line, a sort of reserve. You see it from the top. You see that there are ways of seeing it. The first line can be considered such, but if you look at what you have from the wings perspective, is this 4 blocks placed symmetrically with a 5th one in the center. So basically, there is less pike in the front, is what we were saying before, and that's where the experiments came from. The Swedes accepted to fight with greater frontal amount of shots, which was again risky, but this was compensated by the mobility of these formations that were meant to move faster, and so to attack the Catholic forces that were bulkier, less maneuverable, say hopefully in an asymmetric way, so that you could put the enemy in condition of inferiority and attack them from there, say from the wing. There were, by the way, transversally the whole players some issues regarding the fact that all the units we're talking about were under strength, so at some point several regiments could be grouped together under one command in a brigade. Sometimes the same terms were switched, etc. I made a video especially about the second half of the 16th century for that, but don't be confused overall. We have seen how the Swedes had this other supporting units of shot could be commanded to the cavalry, usually in squad-sized packets. Thus, if you look at the Swedish force and any force that would be based, by the way, on an essentially Swedish model, which naturally spread during the 30 Years' War, well, it presented a relatively more permeable front with more, again, shot, but the apparent thinness was precisely that, apparent, because, in spite of the fact that it was there, it also increased the front size. So this means that the enemy could, yes, push through technically more easily, but it could be outflanked also more easily. And so at this point you would think that, again, what's the difference? If you change the various elements, it's always the same force if you give a basic one. But again, it's not much about this concept, but the fact that it was instrumental to different qualities of training and command and leadership, and that still, again, that the odds were very balanced in spite of the superior Swedish quality. so that the Swedes would be defeated at points, and or suffer serious losses. The same Gustavus Adolphus died in combat, famously enough. So this is just the ineliminable risk in the equation, where you know that you're going to win. Sometimes you're going to be defeated, sometimes, but what matters is what the general forces are in the end, whether you can continue this thing or not. You could even lose all the battles, but win a war. But you don't have to think that it's a collection of, say, pointage at least in just based on the outcome of single engagements. That's not quite just the thing, because there is also politics behind the strategic dimension. In any case, yes, of course, it's better to win orientatively, but you could even lose everything in the last engagement. This does happen in war as well. Now, usually Gustavus Adolphus tried to deploy two separate line of forces. So, as you understand here, fundamentally coping with the lack of depth, right? Because you couldn't quite simply engage an enemy that had, say, twice your depth and saying, well, okay, we will do it just by widening the front, right? Everything that you don't always have the possibility of doing that, first of all, or coordinating the effort. It's naturally easier to do so with forces in depth. It's just safer. It's the principal reserve of fact that you have sort of security measure there to see, well, of course, first battle line is gone. The second two, well, maybe I'll pull out with the third to avoid further losses, whereas you may not know what's going on at the various wings of the formation. This is to extended. We're talking about it for, in fact, linear warfare during the 18th century, all the doctrinal issues of the column and the line, the Grande Carrel. As like the Spanish, the Swedes placed their cavalry on the flanks. However, they bolstered them with musketeers. For Gustavus, more or less made essentially the caracol thing decline, right? At least pistols were there, as we will see, they were used, right? But the sense again that the Swedish broke back cold steel and the cavalry shock, having learned to fight with hell object shock cavalries in Poland, is a famous thing too, right? This changed overall the pattern of a century, at least what had been, again, cavalry shock charges had been coming back from a while, but they hadn't found, let's say, the fullest expression until this point, because there was also just a psychological prejudice, right? And again, Catholic forces, as mostly dominant, tactically had not, for the aforementioned reason, experimented more than much. While Gustavus Adolphus relied on cavalry shock a lot, right, rather than infantry shock and firepower. Of course, cavalry was not decisive as an arm. It wouldn't be anymore historically, but it wasn't already from quite some time, because one thing is being the most important, like throughout all the end of the Middle Ages still, but then eventually being surpassed, and at that point hegemonic just had been in the 13th century, the second half of the 12th. Now, the idea behind this doctrine, we can so say anachronistically, was to charge full tilt at the enemy infantry, preferably at his shot, right? But if necessary, at his pikes. Also because the latter were, much more important, right? They were heavy infantry as such, and so if you broke that, also the shot didn't have much a chance to win the ground alone. Now, the front rank troopers could fire their pistols just before contact, but then had to toss them aside and used cold steel, firepower being provided by the commanded musketeers. And supporting all of this, importantly enough, was the artillery, which was deployed in the front as usual. However, always with the so-called leather regimental guns in among the infantry itself that could be transported. It was very light, the lightest, and it had been ideated by the Swedes really, and it allowed to be deployed again at very close range from the enemy, being brought sometimes literally with the infantry together with the cavalry on the enemy flank, right? And this would provide an incredible punch to the Swedish tactics that were trying, as you understand, to fit in this, say, the gaps of the enemy line, thanks to their greater flexibility. Naturally, it's a big word to say, just to explain it just like that, but I mean, these armies were pretty similar still to one another, but overall, right, in this incredibly attritional clashes that remained such also as long as they were, say, very, very lasting affairs and so on, these frenzy, right, of interaction of arms was rewarding the Swedes, right? While the cavalry was going at it, the infantry, both shot and pike, would also be engaged heavily. Needless to say, the pattern was very much like that of the Spanish. There was much difference aside from thinner lines that again could simply be doubled. Right, this had always been the thing, as we've seen. Also, the Spanish could use deeper lines at some point, and tendentially, this sort of smaller units were being experimented by the Catholics as well. So also thinner lines for them, etc. Just the Swedes were doing it in a more comprehensive, homogeneous, uniform way. Indeed, Gustavus Adolphus soon learned that he could reduce his lines from the traditional 10 or more to 6, and eventually even 3 men without a serious loss in efficiency. And with a considerable gain instead in mobility and flexibility. So, for example, no Spanish army could have shifted from, like the Swedes left did at Breitenfeld. This, again, will be clear when we describe the battle, but again, the idea of exploiting a gap in the enemy line and being able to bring as much firepower there faster and more orderly than the enemy, even though it was done all in a very clumsy way, right, still was done, right, and the Swedes were better at that than the Catholics. So on the other hand, a Swedish army code, as the Spanish were at Rocroi with the enemy all around them, would probably have crumbled away far sooner. So this depends again on the circumstances. There is no such thing like a thing that always wins, even when it has an advantage intrinsically to it, and it's all much more relative than it seems. But there is definitely an absolute outcome there that you must be able to identify. We may not be able to reconstruct even exactly how these battles were fought, but if we look at the outcome, we can appreciate, even statistically, it was something right here and there that differed on the basis of these models. Needless to say, there were thus advantages and disadvantages to both systems. Right? As things turned out, that's the most important thing. The advantages of the Swedish system normally managed to outweigh those of the Spanish one, but as Nordlingen, for example, proved, not completely. And again, there is a great similarity in the essence of warfare at this point in Europe. Now, the Catholics, by the way, were not just sitting ducks in terms of military innovation. After initial reverses at the hands of the Swedes, they made some changes to the Spanish system, practically, to compensate for innovations or even to copy them. Thus, for example, at Breitenfeld, they grouped batches of 3 tercios together in a way which resembled the Swedish brigades, although they failed to assign a separate commander to each grouping, so the thing was still less flexible, autonomous. Later on, the Catholics established tactical brigades of sorts themselves. This again depended not just on a competition in all things tactical, right? It was also an organizational need. It was just also a political issue for some reason. And there were, of course, common insights, right? Surely there was a broader understanding of what needed to be done, but very often it could not be done, right? So this changes are very gradual. Even the theoretical systematization is somehow still based on some sort of generalities, some sort of anecdotes, and there is some sort of also of theory enucleating itself with some practical application that emerges. If you look at the works of Montecuccoli, for example, you understand that as the milestone in military thinking between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz, for sure, but we're still far also from a complete explanation or rationalization of the art of war that would confer a positive application just of notions that were written down. Warfare was still much about the single commander's decisions, preferences, ideas that conflicted with one another. Was also an important degree of speculation, and sometimes we give too much importance to it, because again, when you're on the field, you can't quite, even if you have some preference, or you think that things work in a way, maybe you're right, but still in that battle, that you wouldn't have the possibility to enact, because you even gave the right order, but something went wrong in between, and so it's not a problem of, say, doctrine, let's say, but it's a problem of how just all the possible wrong things that can go on can happen on the battlefield will happen, in fact. So that's it. There was, of course, still this thinning of, again, of formations, whereby the Catholics always fought with thicker lines than the Swedes. They even learned to use cavalry in this enhanced shock fashion, collectively, in a coordinated sort of single-driven fashion, rather than by caracole, right? It's also a bit of stereotype to think that this, especially the latter tactic, was a sort of just Catholic thing. This stuff was generalized, right? So it was about moving on, experimenting else, and realize the increasing importance of combined armed tactics, because it all stemmed from the latter. You see, you don't need to think, okay, well, there is cavalry that has a potential. You must test it on the field. It must be, say, cavalry. You see, these arms have always the same potential as far as how you could ideally use them, right? Or how you would like to ideally enhance them. And you can technically do it. You can choose to force that. The point is understanding how real war is going to be fought. So how this applies to the practical reality that is also generalized, but of course can differ from place to place, so from circumstance to circumstance. And so you can't quite simply understand from a day to another. And again, there is a general awareness of what can be improved, but also the most obvious realization that it can't be done because of lack of resources, for example. Eventually, the concept of having some musketeers supporting the cavalry caught on to among the Catholics. In all of these developments, one man's name stands out definitely, that is the Imperial Field Marshal and somehow opportunist von Wallenstein, who, as you know, was a bit the response to this Protestant achievement. One may almost say that Gustavus and Wallenstein, with a behind-the-scenes assist from Maurice of Orange deeply and somehow altered the nature of war in the 17th century. It's better to say that they catalyzed changes that would have occurred anyway, and again, European warfare was at this point becoming really uniform. So it's a bit difficult to think that there would have been other major factors that would have changed the war. Like even if this, say, the art of war in the centuries, even if these guys had not come around, right? Again, the reason why tactics change is also because strategies change, because politics change, and this is something altogether much bigger, more important, and more influential than tactics, right? So the latter are definitely depending on that rather than the other way around. Certainly, the battles of the following two generations were something any of them could have felt comfortable in. And finally, because of course they were improving somehow in that same flexibility and combined arms capacity that they had been striving for. But even that period, so just a very gradual change. A lot could be said. Again, until we entered the single battles, it's a bit complicated to explain the thing in concrete, even quantitative terms. And so, of course, a number of interesting ideas existed during this period, which occasionally influenced the course of battles, even from theory, but also from, again, the generalized code of honor, for example. How would these people fight, and what would they fight for? This is perhaps an overlooked aspect, because we always see war, of course, as a matter of, say, sort of quarterless fight, right? But the idea was that winning, while desirable, was pointless if done without a certain phase involved. Actually, this is true throughout all military history. There is always a sense of, okay, let's still negotiate something about it, because at the end of the day, it's politics. That's why they do it. We focus on the military side of the story, but again, that is instrumental to politics. So war, as von Clausewitz explains, is always the same in concept, right? What you need to do points always to the same absolute direction. That, of course, cannot be attained in reality, because real war instead is declined to an incredible level of different circumstances, and so there is a chameleon-like nature of war in that regard. But it's not because there is an essential point towards which you have to go, right? So honor was important because this various powers' cultural background, just understanding the relations between one another, were increasingly important, even in terms of what was done on the battlefield, because of possible grievances, of possible, say, openings to negotiations and so on, right? We talked about 17th century diplomacy in multiple videos, and we'll keep talking about this. It was extremely complicated, and everything really about the war depended on it. Now, it was rare that a general took on his opponent before the latter was ready. This comes from practical circumstances. This was partially due, at least, to the fact that getting an army into battle order was a complicated affair, and so both generals were usually too busy kicking their troops into line and settling precedence disputes among regiments to bother with their opposition. But of course, there were generally operational reasons that, of course, would bring these armies to be prepared, to be just encamped in certain ways that would prevent the enemy to venture on a ground that, for example, was unfavorable, etc. This is true for all military history. All right. There would be instances in which even when one army had clear advantage in deployment, it often refused to take on an undeployed foe. But let's say you can't see the 30 Years' War necessarily a more or less honorable time to see this happening just because of courtesy, right? It was just mostly dictated by those negotiation circumstances that depended on the same general sometimes, right? Sometimes it was really honor. It was really about feeling that it would have been unfair not to measure the full brunt of each other's forces to determine who really had the upper hand, right? The sense was that, morally speaking, there could be a sense of you stole that victory. And so an incredible grievance and sort of mockery and, say, contempt towards your name could be spread. A good example is the Spanish at Rocroi, where they could easily have hit the French while the latter were but half deployed, but they wouldn't. Naturally, again, don't trust too much the sources as well, because you may find one source saying it, but the thing not really corresponding to reality. Sometimes you don't even know what the enemy is doing, so it depends. Like, we do not know too much after all about these engagements, especially in the strict operational or tactical detail. But we do know that such values were out there. On this much, there was no doubt. War was seen still as an aristocratic sport, where name in that sense would respond of such events, such behavior, such decision. There was also a lot about, again, that unequivocal honor and glory for the survivors, and it's also possible that the idea of just the enemy fielding completely, and so being even bottled in a certain situation played that role, especially when it came to importance of loot, right? But there were sometimes things like victories that you couldn't quite say where they were. It had been worth it, right? Merely killing a few of the enemy, while useful reducing his manpower, did not necessarily mean one was any closer to winning the war. Maybe that was seen even again as a boost to the enemy. This is a generalized and relative comment, of course, but we have seen, for example, the Battle of Freiburg, that there was a relative, you can say there was an inconclusiveness of it all. There's a bit the rhetoric of, oh my god, they died so much, was it really worth it, whatever. Well, if they were fighting there, evidently it was, right? Especially if they killed so much each other in that way, there was surely a motivation for that to happen, which we don't see because we can't quantify moral forces, but it had to do with what the world had been before that moment. And so it's difficult to measure. That's the most difficult thing to measure in a military sense. And very often military quality actually stands from the side of the people who believe more in what they're doing. And so in a general sense, they are better prepared as well. There were, of course, several wars in which the loser won most of the battles, as we were saying before. How to use battles in such a way as to bring the final victory strategically is the true test of military leadership. So we'll talk about strategy next time. But it's important always to realize that the level of uncertainty of warfare could give rise to that kind of question, like, what was that action specifically aiming to? Especially from a tactical point of view, you have to pass to strategy, then you have to pass to policy, to politics. It's not so immediately obvious what, let's say, a certain fight will have done, right, or such. But this is say, trying to comment on the nature of war per se, right, and realizing that there is hardly a capacity to simply calculate, given that war is mostly about moral forces, the general circumstances that, say, and the quantities involved and the cause-effect connections, etc. So now I'm really digressing in the philosophical, but war is not, war is real, so we can't obviously deny that such things must be assessed, and I think we should be more courageous about that. I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of war. Like, not much why war is fought in the first place, which actually may be actually the most fascinating topic of all, and it actually makes a lot of sense in the entire moral and scientific knowledge that we have. War makes a lot of sense. Even when who fights it doesn't know how to, or is not, like, war is always fought between two sides. So that always has a meaning overall that determines on that ground what is that it's being really fought over, right? And that is perhaps the thing that, as more important, we have also forgotten more. People don't like war fundamentally because they don't understand it. This is, I think, what it seems to me like. This is not about the terrible experience in itself. It is the fact that most people do not like the fact that war is unpredictable, and that depends on factors that they're not habituated to consider, even for themselves. That is the moral quality of something. Hence, people have to think that the war is fought by just evil, old, greedy people that want to send pure and pure innocent lambs to massacre. Because, of course, the average idiot doesn't know any better. But war in of itself is something that perhaps we tend to over-philosophize too much on, but never quite getting to it, because most people do not actually study the single campaigns, the single strategies, the single tactics, the single political connections with war. And that's the only thing that actually answers you, that actually makes a lot of sense, because it is literally what happened. And this stuff happened in reality. So the reason why it's difficult to, in a world like this that doesn't know values practically in a universal, traditional sense, to understand war is obvious, right? You do not see the ultimate point. It's as if there were some clouds that represent your own ignorance, and you can't see the mountaintop, and pretend, since you can't see that it's just, war doesn't make sense, right? Which is very different from saying was it worth it or not. That you should ask to the various sides involved. And I made a video about the relative importance of victory and defeat, because the such thing is not directly proportional to the contendants. And that's again because most people do not understand the connection between politics and war, if not in that sort of fantasy, conspiratorial, delusional, alienated, and undereducated fashion. And really most people don't. Like, this is not to say that there is, even at the top levels, this deeper understanding of this practice, of this experience of war. We live really in an incredibly confused time, and only studying military history or finding that war from a top perspective can actually explain what this thing was about. And very often it's much simpler, let's say, than it seems. It's just only much more difficult than what we think. And that's why it it makes all the more relevant why we fight wars. That is not, again, the simplistic explanation that is usually provided. Especially in the conspiratorial, there is the evil guy behind the clouds that is not, say, when you actually have the evil guy just under the clouds, and you choose not to see it because it's I'm trying to flip this to make you understand that, again, I'm against any populistic sort of delusion regarding the approach to war, especially, right? So that you can't you can definitely see who has more right, let's put it in this way, than the other in war, when you actually know what war is about. Anyhow, we'll keep talking surely about these things in the History playlist, and I hope we will keep talking soon about the 30 Years' War and all these various aspects, and talking, because strategy is also clarifying, of course. It's more important than tactics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.